The email arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, just as I was finishing up the final code review for our latest software release. The sender was someone I'd never heard of, Jennifer Walsh from TechCrunch, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Questions about data flow technologies and stolen intellectual property. My name is Nathan Cross, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Data Flow Technologies, a startup that had spent the last 4 years building revolutionary data analytics software. What started as a late-night coding project in my garage had grown into a company with 47 employees, $12 million in venture funding, and contracts with some of the biggest corporations in America. Or at least, that's what I thought until I opened Jennifer Walsh's email. Mr. Cross, the message began, I'm investigating allegations that Dataflow Technologies' core software platform contains stolen code from Nexus Analytics, a competing firm. Sources claim that your co-founder and CEO, Bradley Morrison, obtained proprietary algorithms and source code through industrial espionage. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to these allegations before publication. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading and rereading the email. Bradley Morrison had been my best friend since college, my business partner for 4 years, and the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. The idea that he would steal code, especially without telling me, was impossible to believe. But as I sat in my home office, surrounded by the awards and recognition our company had received for innovation and technical excellence, a cold realization began to settle over me. If these allegations were true, everything we'd built was based on a lie. And I, as the CTO who had supposedly overseen all technical development, would be seen as either complicit in the theft or incompetent for not detecting it. I needed to understand what was happening before I responded to the journalist. The next morning, I arrived at our office in Austin's tech corridor earlier than usual, hoping to catch Bradley before the rest of the team arrived. Dataflow Technologies occupied the top 2 floors of a modern glass building, with open-plan workspaces, state-of-the-art equipment, and all the amenities that had become standard in successful tech startups. Bradley was already in his corner office, as he always was by 7 a.m. At 34, he was 2 years younger than me, but he'd always been the more ambitious and business-focused of our partnership. While I handled the technical side of the company, Bradley managed investors, clients, and strategic planning. He was charismatic, persuasive, and had a talent for making people believe in our vision. Nathan, he said, looking up from his laptop with his usual enthusiastic smile. Perfect timing. I was just reviewing the Q3 numbers, and they're even better than we projected. The Morrison Analytics module is performing incredibly well with our enterprise clients. The Morrison Analytics module. Named after Bradley himself, it was the crown jewel of our software platform, a sophisticated algorithm that could process massive datasets and identify patterns that human analysts would miss. It was the feature that had attracted our biggest clients and most of our venture funding. It was also, according to the TechCrunch journalist, potentially stolen from Nexus Analytics. Bradley, I said, closing his office door behind me, we need to talk. I got an email last night from a journalist asking about stolen code. She mentioned Nexus Analytics specifically. Bradley's expression didn't change, but I noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. Nexus Analytics? That's Marcus Chen's company, right? The one that went under last year. You tell me, I said. The journalist seems to think we stole their algorithms. She mentioned the Morrison Analytics module specifically. Bradley leaned back in his chair, maintaining his calm demeanor. Nathan, you know as well as I do that we developed that module from scratch. You were involved in every stage of the process. Are you seriously suggesting that we somehow stole code without you knowing about it? He was right, of course. I had been involved in the development of the Morrison Analytics module. But as I thought back to that period 18 months ago, I realized that Bradley had provided much of the initial framework and mathematical foundations. He'd claimed to have developed them during his MBA program at Stanford, working on a thesis project about predictive analytics. Show me your Stanford thesis, I said. Bradley's smile faltered for just a moment. What? Your thesis? The one where you developed the mathematical foundations for the Morrison Analytics module. I'd like to read it. Nathan, what's gotten into you? We're business partners. We're friends. Why are you acting like I'm some kind of criminal? Because a journalist is asking questions about stolen code, and I need to be able to give her honest answers. If you developed those algorithms at Stanford, then showing me your thesis should be easy. Bradley stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Austin skyline. The thesis is confidential. It contains proprietary information that could compromise our competitive advantage. Bradley, I'm the CTO of this company. I have access to all our proprietary information. If you can't show me a thesis that supposedly contains the foundations of our most important product, then we have a serious problem. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Bradley deflecting my questions and providing increasingly implausible explanations for why he couldn't produce documentation of his supposed Stanford research. By the time I left his office, I was convinced that Jennifer Walsh's allegations had merit, but I needed proof. Over the next several days, I began conducting my own investigation into the origins of our core technology. What I discovered was far worse than simple code theft. It was a systematic pattern of deception that went to the heart of our company's success. The first breakthrough came when I contacted Stanford's business school to inquire about Bradley's thesis. After some bureaucratic back and forth, I learned that Bradley had never written a thesis on predictive analytics. In fact, his MBA thesis had been about supply chain optimization in the automotive industry, a topic completely unrelated to our software. The second breakthrough came when I started researching Nexus Analytics, the company that had allegedly been the victim of our theft. Nexus had been founded by Dr. Marcus Chen, a brilliant computer scientist who had developed groundbreaking algorithms for pattern recognition in large datasets. The company had shown tremendous promise but had collapsed suddenly in early 2022 after losing several major clients and running out of funding. What made this particularly interesting was the timing. Nexus Analytics had failed just 3 months before Bradley had supposedly developed the Morrison Analytics module that became the foundation of our success. I reached out to Dr. Chun through LinkedIn, introducing myself as a fellow entrepreneur and asking if he'd be willing to discuss his experience with Nexus Analytics. He agreed to meet for coffee, probably hoping I might be a potential investor or collaborator. Dr. Chun was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time thinking about algorithms than personal grooming. When I mentioned that I was from Dataflow Technologies, his expression darkened. Dataflow, he said. I know that company. You're the ones who stole my life's work. I explained that I was investigating allegations of code theft and wanted to understand what had happened to Nexus Analytics. Dr. Chen's story was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Nexus Analytics had been developing revolutionary pattern recognition algorithms for 3 years when they were approached by a potential investor named Bradley Morrison. Bradley had presented himself as a venture capitalist interested in funding their expansion, and he'd spent several weeks conducting due diligence on their technology. During this process, Bradley had gained access to Nexus's source code, technical documentation, and proprietary algorithms. He'd asked detailed questions about their mathematical models and had even suggested improvements to their approach. Dr. Chan had been impressed by Bradley's technical knowledge and had been optimistic about securing funding, but the investment never materialized. Bradley had suddenly stopped returning calls and emails, claiming that his fund had decided to focus on other opportunities. 3 months later, Dr. Chan had discovered that Dataflow Technologies, a company he'd never heard of, was marketing software that used algorithms virtually identical to those he'd developed at Nexus. I tried to pursue legal action, Dr. Chun told me, but I didn't have the resources to fight a well-funded startup. My company was already failing, and I couldn't afford a prolonged court battle. I had to watch as your company became successful using technology that I'd spent years developing. I left the coffee shop feeling sick to my stomach. Bradley hadn't just stolen code. He'd destroyed a man's company and career in the process. And he'd used that stolen technology to build our success while positioning himself as a visionary entrepreneur. But I still needed irrefutable proof before I could take action. The proof came when I decided to conduct a detailed analysis of our source code, comparing it to publicly available information about Nexus Analytics technology. What I found was damning. Core sections of our most important algorithms were virtually identical to code that Dr. Chun had described in academic papers and patent applications. More damaging was the discovery that Bradley had been systematically covering his tracks. I found evidence that he'd been modifying code comments, changing variable names, and restructuring functions to disguise the stolen origins of our technology. He'd been careful and methodical, but not careful enough to fool someone with my level of technical expertise. The final piece of evidence came from our company's own records. I discovered that Bradley had been in contact with several former Nexus Analytics employees, offering them jobs at Dataflow just weeks after their company had collapsed. These employees had brought with them detailed knowledge of Nexus's technology, which Bradley had used to refine and improve the stolen algorithms. I now had comprehensive evidence that our company's success was built on stolen intellectual property. The question was what to do about it. My first instinct was to confront Bradley directly and demand that he come clean about what he'd done. But I realized that a private confrontation would give him the opportunity to destroy evidence, manipulate the narrative, or even try to implicate me in the theft. Instead, I decided to document everything and prepare for a more strategic revelation. Working late at night and on weekends, I compiled a comprehensive report detailing Bradley's theft of Nexus Analytics technology. I included source code comparisons, timeline analysis, communication records, and testimony from Dr. Chen and former Nexus employees. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But I didn't stop there. I also began investigating other aspects of Bradley's business practices, looking for additional evidence of deception or fraud. What I found was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the Nexus theft. Bradley had been systematically lying to our investors about our technology's origins, claiming credit for innovations he'd stolen from other companies. He'd been inflating our user metrics and revenue projections to secure additional funding. He'd been backdating stock option grants to give himself more favorable terms. And he'd been using company funds for personal expenses, disguising them as business costs. The man I trusted as my best friend and business partner was a serial fraudster who had built his success on lies, theft, and deception. But the most infuriating discovery was that Bradley had been planning to push me out of the company. I found emails between Bradley and our board of directors discussing my limited business acumen and suggesting that the company would be better served with a more commercially focused CTO. He'd been positioning himself to take full control of Dataflow while marginalizing my role and contributions. Bradley Morrison had stolen technology to build our company, lied to investors and employees about our capabilities, and was planning to betray the person who had trusted him most. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The plan I developed was designed to expose Bradley's crimes in a way that would be both devastating and undeniable. I couldn't simply go to the police or the SEC. Corporate fraud cases could take years to investigate and prosecute, and Bradley might be able to destroy evidence or flee the country. I needed to create a moment of revelation that would be immediate, public, and impossible to deny. The opportunity came in the form of our annual company meeting, scheduled for the first week of December. This was always a major event, with all employees, board members, and key investors gathering to review our progress and discuss future plans. Bradley had been planning to use the meeting to announce our Series C funding round and his vision for expanding into international markets. I had different plans for the meeting. Working with Jennifer Walsh, the TechCrunch journalist who had first contacted me, I prepared a comprehensive expose of Bradley's crimes. The article would be published online at exactly 2 p.m. on the day of our company meeting, just as Bradley was scheduled to give his keynote presentation. But I also prepared my own presentation for the meeting, one that would reveal the truth about our company's technology and Bradley's deception to everyone who mattered. The annual meeting was held at a downtown Austin hotel, in a ballroom that could accommodate our growing team and investor group. Bradley had spared no expense on the event, hiring professional videographers, catering from the city's best restaurants, and even bringing in a motivational speaker to kick off the day. As employees, investors, and board members filled the ballroom, I watched Bradley work the room with his usual charisma and confidence. He was in his element, shaking hands, sharing jokes, and painting a picture of unlimited growth and success. He had no idea that his world was about to collapse. The morning sessions went as planned, with various department heads presenting updates on their progress and achievements. I gave a technical presentation about our software architecture, carefully avoiding any mention of the Morrison Analytics module or its origins. Bradley seemed pleased with how the day was progressing. At 1:45 p.m., Bradley took the stage to deliver his keynote address. He began with his usual enthusiasm, talking about our company's mission, our innovative technology, and our bright future. He spoke eloquently about the importance of integrity, innovation, and teamwork in building a successful company. At exactly 2 p.m., as Bradley was describing our revolutionary analytics capabilities, I received a text message from Jennifer Walsh. Article is live. I stood up from my seat in the front row and walked toward the stage. Bradley paused his presentation, looking confused by my interruption. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, taking the microphone from Bradley, I need to share some important information about our company and our technology. The room fell silent as I pulled up my own presentation on the large screens behind me. The first slide was simple: the truth about data flow technologies. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything Bradley had built. I presented the evidence of his theft from Nexus Analytics, showing side-by-side comparisons of our code and their original algorithms. I revealed his lies to investors about our technology's origins and his inflation of our business metrics. I exposed his financial fraud and his plans to push me out of the company. Each slide was backed by irrefutable evidence: emails, source code, financial records, and testimony from witnesses. The presentation was devastating in its thoroughness and clarity. Bradley tried to interrupt several times, claiming that I was lying or that the evidence was fabricated. But the documentation was too comprehensive and the sources too credible for his denials to have any impact. The room was in stunned silence as I concluded my presentation with a final slide. Bradley Morrison built this company on stolen technology, lies, and fraud. He has betrayed every person in this room who trusted him with their careers, their investments, and their futures. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Our board of directors immediately suspended Bradley and launched an internal investigation. Our investors began legal proceedings to recover their funds and protect their interests. The SEC opened a formal investigation into securities fraud. And Dr. Marcus Chun, armed with the evidence I'd provided, filed a lawsuit for intellectual property theft. Bradley was arrested 2 weeks later on charges of corporate fraud, securities violations, and theft of trade secrets. The evidence I'd compiled made the case straightforward for prosecutors, and Bradley eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. But the consequences extended far beyond Bradley's personal downfall. Dataflow Technologies was forced to cease operations while legal proceedings determined the ownership of our technology. Our employees lost their jobs, our investors lost their money, and our clients lost access to software they'd come to depend on. I could have tried to distance myself from the scandal, claiming ignorance of Bradley's crimes and attempting to salvage my own reputation. But I felt a responsibility to the people who had been harmed by our company's deception. Instead, I worked with Dr. Chun to establish a new company that would legitimately license and develop the technology that Bradley had stolen. We hired as many former Dataflow employees as possible, ensuring that talented people wouldn't be permanently harmed by Bradley's crimes. We also established a fund to compensate investors who had been defrauded by Bradley's lies. 6 months after the company meeting that destroyed Dataflow Technologies, I sat in my new office, working on legitimate innovations that would advance the field of data analytics without relying on stolen technology. Dr. Chun had become my business partner, and together we were building something that was both technically superior and ethically sound. Bradley Morrison was serving a 5-year prison sentence for corporate fraud and theft of trade secrets. His reputation in the tech industry was destroyed, and he would never again be trusted with other people's money or ideas. The man who had built his success on lies and theft was facing the consequences of his choices. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the impact on the broader tech industry. The Dataflow scandal had sparked conversations about due diligence, intellectual property protection, and the importance of ethical leadership in startups. Other companies had implemented stronger safeguards against code theft, and investors had become more careful about verifying the origins of the technology they funded. As I worked on developing new algorithms that would genuinely advance the state of data analytics, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned about trust, integrity, and the true meaning of innovation. For 4 years, I'd believed that Bradley and I were building something revolutionary together. I'd been proud of our technical achievements and excited about our potential to change the world. The discovery that our success was built on stolen technology had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. I no longer had to live with the nagging doubt that our innovations weren't quite as groundbreaking as they seemed. I no longer had to wonder why certain aspects of our technology felt familiar or why some of our breakthroughs had come so easily. Now I was building something real, something that belonged to us, something that would stand up to scrutiny and competition. The work was harder and the progress was slower, but every line of code was honest, every algorithm was original, and every success was earned. The notification sound from my computer interrupted my thoughts. It was an email from a potential client, a Fortune 500 company that wanted to discuss our data analytics capabilities. They'd heard about our work and were interested in learning more about our approach to pattern recognition and predictive modeling. I smiled as I began drafting my response. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to innovate, and new chances to prove that success built on integrity was more valuable than success built on deception. The startup saboteur had learned that stolen technology might provide short-term advantages, but it could never create lasting value. Bradley Morrison had thought he could build an empire on other people's innovations, but he'd forgotten that true success requires more than just clever code. It requires character, honesty, and the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult. In the end, his betrayal had destroyed not just his own future, but the futures of everyone who had trusted him. The man who had stolen his way to the top had learned that some foundations are too weak to support the weight of ambition, and some shortcuts lead nowhere but to ruin. The tech industry was better off without him, and I was better off knowing the truth.